There have been several alarming new reports that the climate crisis is getting worse and coming on faster.
There seems to be no good place for the water to go in the Southern California desert. Torrential rain swamping roads and trapping cars.
The hydrology in the state has begun to change pretty significantly. The aridification that we're experiencing leads us now, the science and the data leads us to now understand that we will lose 10% of our water supply by 2040.
But the real underlying thing is that there is no climate crisis.
The Earth is always changing. Climate change is nothing you have to prove. It always is happening. It always has happened. So to make that into something alarming seems to me a little bit weird.
We like to make the themes in these various sessions blend together, so ironically and interestingly, the theme of our second session will be, is it okay to have feelings about water? Before we start the second session, I think Steve would like to make some fairly important comments about the content we're going to cover in this one. Steve?
Thank you, Fritz. If I can I'll speak as everyone finishes the conversation. So this is a more sensitive subject per se, and even our committee had quite a bit of discussion and on whether to do it and how to handle it. And I felt it was important because as water policy makers, we're constantly being told and having the media put it at our constituents and others that are in the legislature, in the Congress, and the governor that climate change is affecting our water, it's affecting this, it's affecting that. And so we should take all these certain measures because of climate change. And so I felt it's important for us to examine this as to how it relates to how we make policies related to water supply. What is affecting our water supply? Is it the change in the climate, the change in the weather? Is it policies from Sacramento and Washington, D.C. that are affecting our water supply? Why are we needing now to, as I call, ration water down to 48 gallons per person in the household, or then down to 42? Is that because the climate has sucked up all our water? So we want to look at this as to what really is the situation. We have two esteemed experts, very credible experts in the field, but we're not here to debate climate change or climate adaptation or fluctuation. We all agree there's a weather change. We all agree the weather changes. So we're here to hear what they have to say, and then as how that affects our policy making as to the session you just heard and as to creating more water supply. Just wanted to bookend that. Thank you. I'll bring Fritz right behind me. Thank you, Fritz. Appreciate the opportunity.
What he said. Okay. All right, today's second session. Is it fair to blame climate change for everything? Takes a look at past and present climate data and whether this data influences our water future. We'll also dive headfirst into the media's role in presenting facts and misinformation on this important topic. Joining me today are three distinguished speakers. You'll hear from each of them back to back. We'll then have time for a few questions. Please welcome Dr. John R. Christy, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric and Earth Sciences and State Climatologist at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Rong Fu, who is Professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Science at UCLA and the Director of the Joint Institute of Regional Earth System Science and Engineering. And Steve Greenhut, Western Regional Director of R Street Institute, and we'll hear from Dr. Fu first.
Great. Should I sit here?
No, you stand up there and make your presentation. Walk around the room, whatever you'd like to do.
Well,
you can stand up if you choose.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
First of all, thank everyone and thank organizer for this opportunity to share our research result. All results I presented are observations and aiming at perhaps clarify the question, how much we can blame weather, how much we can blame climate change. We all know drought. Drought has been mainly caused by precipitation deficits, including the mega drought happened in the last millennium in the history. And evaporative loss, which is mainly driven by temperature, contribute about a quarter of the drought severity. But this has changed since around 2000. And what we observed is now evaporative loss is now surpassed the precipitation deficits, become main contributor of the drought severity. And because of that, the drought severity over western United States, including 11 states, has increased about 35%. And the area of the drought has expanded about 17%, translate into about 41 million acres. And this is primarily because the increase of evaporative loss driven by mainly the warmer temperature. So now let's look at the last drought, 2020 and the 2022 drought. So in this drought, evaporative loss contributed about 55%, whereas 56%, whereas the precipitation deficit contribute less than half. And now if we look at this figure, and this shows the drought severity, and one is observed, one is what we should expect if there were no climate change. Basically, the part of the drought you can link to extreme weather. So you can just see that observed, more than half, 55% of the western United States is close to default drought, and which means 50 years to 100 years return time. But if we remove the warmer temperature climate changing effect, it's about 3% of western state, western United States should expect default-like drought. So here, the influence of climate changing is quite a surprise even to me. So the next is we talk about the Colorado River drought, and this has been last more than 20 years. What contribute to this drought? So we also look at the data, and now we look at the since 2000 up to last year. And now let's look at the upper Colorado River basin, which contribute about 90% of the river flow. And what we now can see is, and we look at the precipitation deficit, we look at increase of evaporative demand here as presented as a potential evapotranspiration. So it's clear that majority of the deficit, soil moisture deficit, is due to increase of evaporative demand. Precipitation deficit is only less than 3% contribute. And now if we remove the climate change event, let's look at how weather pattern contribute to influence precipitation deficit and evaporative demand. And 10% of increasing evaporative demand could be linked to weather. So again, this is mainly it's due to warming and linked to climate change. So finally, let's look at fire weather. So we all know fire has more than doubled over western state, and it's affect our life. I mean, all of us probably experienced fire events more than one time. And so we all know fire is a part of the natural phenomena of the western United States. It's part of the ecosystem. And usually when you have a fire and you have extreme weather events. And so now let's look at how much weather events contribute to the example, let's say the August complex fire. This is the largest fire in California history, recorded history. So if we look at the vapor pressure deficit, which is commonly used to represent evaporative demand, it's also the leading environmental condition for large-scale wildfire. So now I marked here. So the August complex fire, you can see is linked to almost record higher vapor pressure deficit. And the red line here is what we observed. But if you look at the black line, which is the vapor pressure deficit associated with extremely strong high pressure system. And so that is about 60% of what we observe. Now, if you look at the creek fire, the weather pattern induced higher vapor pressure deficit is actually only 40% of what we observed. So here you can see the impact of warming on this fire. So basically, for the same extreme high pressure, and now you see vapor pressure deficit surge twice as much, almost twice as much, as you would see if the same extreme weather events happened before 99. So basically, in conclusion, should we blame everything to climate change? I think we shouldn't, but climate change clearly have very strong impact. For same precipitation deficit, now you see drought is more than 30% stronger. For the same extreme weather system, now you see vapor pressure deficit almost doubled. So while climate change may initiate all these drought and the extreme weather, it certainly make it more severe. And that leads to stronger fire, stronger drought. And I think that help clarify the question of the session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fu. Dr. Christy.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to stand up here. I'm John Christy, Alabama State Climatologist, and you're wondering, why is the Alabama State Climatologist here? I was born and raised in Fresno County, and was a weather nerd from the very beginning. I've actually testified before Congress many times and many state and local agencies, water boards especially, about climate change. But most importantly is that I was a California climate nerd from the very beginning. This is my April 1967 weather record. And you can see I had a 1/4 inch to write everything that happened in the day. And I put 4 lines in a 1/4 inch. I had about 35 observations I would take per day. So the California climate story is just really part of my whole life, as you can see here. And I published in the peer-reviewed literature on California climate situations. So I build data sets from scratch, basically, whether they be from satellites or surface records or so on, to answer questions about climate and what it's doing and why it might be doing something. So that's really what I do, is answer questions about climate. In fact, I wrote a book, Is It Getting Hotter in Fresno or Not? And it talks about how do you build a climate data set and how difficult it is. And if anyone here buys this book on Amazon.com, my sales will go into double digits. Since that was about, is it getting hotter in Fresno or not? And the answer is actually no, and yes. But let's look at heat waves, since we're talking about heat. Has the West experienced more heat waves recently in the last 110 years? And if you live in California, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, or Washington, you can see this chart over the last 110 years that, yes, the last decade had more heat waves than any other decade you've had. Is that climate change? No. When you look at the upper Midwest and Ohio Valley, they have the fewest amount of heat wave days they've ever had. So the gray bars, at least they were gray when I put them on there, are the United States average. And you can see there's actually a slight downward trend in the heat waves that this country has been experiencing. And the last decade is just right at average. So yes, California and the West has had some hot periods recently, but you cannot blame it on climate change. Otherwise, you don't have a way to blame what's happening in the East on climate change. If you mean by climate change, human-induced climate change. Okay, how about 100-degree days? In California, this is the number of 100-degree days every 5 years, average per station in the bars, the yellow bars. The answer is again yes. If you look at those last 2 up there, you will see that they are the highest 2 5 years in the past 105 years. Country as a whole, though, is just going along. The worst was back in the 30s. I put up here the southeast where I now live in Alabama, and you can see that our temperatures have actually fallen and that's just happened throughout the southeastern United States. And I wrote a paper that's absolutely no climate model ever has been able to forecast or predict what has actually happened in the real world. And I've got many papers on that kind of stuff as well. So I hope you guys realize, now, I just said you guys because I'm back here at home in Alabama, we'd say y'all. But you guys will realize, I think, just from a picture like that, well, I don't see anything out of the ordinary happening. Here is wildfire for the last 400 years in the West. You can see that wildfires until prior to European settlement were just enormous. You know, no one put out fires before European settlements because Europeans didn't want their stuff to burn up. And so they started putting out fires, and you see the rapid decline, massive decline in wildfire. They are not increasing, except if you look at the last 20, 30 years. You see a little uptick? Let's blow that up right here. And here we see on the brownish line, that's what's happened in the U.S. And you can see a rise in wildfires. Notice the Yellowstone fires in 1988 is the real reason this has increased, because that was a time when the federal government, the interagencies, figured out that wildfire was good for a lot of places. And so this is from their 2023 statement here, that wildfire is a natural, essential, ecological element or process, and so they're going to be allowed to burn. And so now the numbers are rising a little bit because of management. It all comes down to human management. Now, I have here the California wildfire today, much, much lower than it ever has been. 2020 was the worst year you've had in a long time. That creek fire came 4 miles from my property in Fresno County up there in the foothills. So I'm grateful for the firefighters that were working on that. But I don't have any structures on my property because if it burns, it's going to burn. And that's what happened. Anyway, you see this red line here? That's where natural and Native American fires were, on the order of 8 million acres a year, whereas now it's often less than even 1 million acres a year. So wildfires are not increasing. Now, are we in a mega drought? I heard, a couple of years ago there's stories about California in a mega drought. Well, that's just not true, because let's go up to Cliff Lake in Fresno County, and you see here's a lake, and right below the surface, 5 meters, is a stump. And that stump grew on dry ground for 50 years, back in 1290 to 1340 AD. When the alpine lakes of California dry up and forests start growing in their lake bottoms, that's a mega drought. What we have now is not a mega drought, or you would see this kind of thing happening. Can a mega drought occur again? Yes, it can, but it's not going on right now. Here's the precipitation in your area here, from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. Santa Ana's right in the center of it. Ups and downs, that's your climate change. It's what happens from one year to the next is really your climate change. And being able to manage that, my hat's off to you, because you don't know what's going to happen next year. And just like last year, who could have predicted that? So the climate change is something that is bigger year to year than any kind of slow trend that might happen along the way. How about heavy rainfall events? I took the 5-day periods that had the most rain in these 5 cities from Santa Barbara down to San Diego and put them where they occurred in time. So this is the events that occurred in time for those stations. And you can see that none happened in the last 5 years, by the way. They're all back in the middle of the 20th century, most of them. But there's really no trend. You could get clobbered next year. There's no question about that. But there's no change in that kind of situation. Here's snowfall in the Southern Sierra. I just had this published last year. And there's no trend at all. It still snows in the Sierra. What you have to think about is in 2022, it was about half of normal. In 2023, it was 2.5 times normal. That's a range of 5 times. That's the climate change that you have to figure out how to handle. That's the flywheel, I guess, your aquifer here supplies for you. I think that's just a great picture of the type of feast and famine climate you have, because you're right at the southern edge of the storm tracks. What's the future say? These are 37 of the climate models that were available to me to tell what's going to happen out to 2010 for rainfall in your area. 37, 19 said positive trend, 18 said negative trend, and that's exactly what you should understand is no one knows. No one knows what's going to happen. So, finally, it's not fair to blame climate change for everything or much of anything. If there is a perception of a water shortage, it's due to something else. And our next speaker might want to address that.
All right, good job. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Christy, for dispelling every theory we've had in this room until this point. Mr. Greenhut, you have 10 minutes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, during the last drought and the one before that, I'm still covering the Jerry Brown drought. Official discussions focused almost entirely on climate change. So, I mean, I covered it and was at many Capitol press conferences. I'm not a climate scientist, obviously, and I don't doubt that climate change exists. In fact, my main employer is the R Street Institute. They broke away from the Heartland Institute 12 years ago after Heartland ran those kind of nutty Unabomber ads in Chicago where it said, I still believe in global warming, do you? That was too much for the group of Heartlanders and who did a lot of work on insurance issues. And of course, insurance companies believe that the climate is changing. They put their money there in figuring that. So anyway, so I'm not coming from a group that is a climate denier. But we are skeptical of many of the policies that the state is fomenting to try to deal with everything. So, and then we also realize that not every weather event's the result of the Earth's changing climate. As we just saw, there is stuff just weather. It always changes. In my book, Winning the Water Wars, I'll give a little pitch for it here, I open with a quotation from Joan Didion. She recalled how California summers were characterized by the coughing in the pipes that meant the well was dry, and California winters all-night watches of rivers cresting, which in fact my wife and I've done because we live a half mile from the Cosumnes, the last undammed river in the state, and we watch it. You know, you could watch it come down from the Sierras on the computer and know when to clear the goats out and run away. Anyway, we just tossed out our sandbags from the last heavy rains. So last year, California EPA issued a report saying the stark reality of climate change in California is clear: record high temperatures, an unrelenting drought, and unprecedented wildfires, on and on and on. Actually, the drought did in fact relent in February. So are the droughts and the wildfires the result of climate change? Maybe, but the point of my book is this: a proper water policy revolves around preparing the state for whatever happens, whatever Mother Nature sends our way. Californians tend to think big, but I think our ability to change the entire Earth's climate is limited. A little humility ought to be in order in a state that can't even, clean up homeless encampments or fill in the blank problem, right? But our ability to build a resilient system that assures we have enough water for a once growing population anyway, it's limitless. We can actually build resiliency. As an aside, when I was writing my book, there are academics saying, well, what's the point of building water storage? There's no rain, there's no snowpack. Well, that would be true if it never rains again. So I think history bears out that it will rain again. So what I call for is let's build the water storage facilities we need to capture more water during rainy years. Matt talks about the big gulp, little sip. We don't have to take all the water, but we just could take a little more to meet our needs, build the infrastructure and the dams, expand those. How about permitting desalination plants, which don't even, take a lot of government money, right? That's mostly privately funded, and we saw what Governor Newsom's appointees to the California Coastal Commission did with the Huntington Beach plant, which would have met, 12% of Southern California's, or not Southern California, Orange County's water needs. So, more of everything. It's kind of an everything, all of the above. I like to point out the Orange County's wonderful recycling system. That's great. Stormwater capture. There's all sorts of things, and everyone can argue, and I'm sure you all have here, over which ones ought to be prioritized. But I think we could deal with the problem by focusing. My book, I say California can meet its water needs by promoting abundance rather than managing scarcity. So if that's the philosophy, I think we could all, argue over and figure out which projects are most cost effective, but that's the general philosophy, and I think that's the key rather than just totally focusing on climate change. So I talk about resiliency, right? We should build a system that handles whatever Mother Nature throws her way. And of course, conservation is good. Nobody's against conservation. But I think water pricing might help conservation naturally rather than having, in Sacramento area, we actually had water police looking at people watering their yards too much. I don't think that's a future that any of us want. We certainly don't want that future where more farm fields are fallowed. But after the February storms, Governor Newsom, he issued an executive order that I actually found encouraging. At least I even wrote an editorial praising it. And it talks about the frequency of hydraulic extremes that is being experienced in California demonstrates the need to continually adapt to promote resiliency in a changing climate. And he talks about provisions to protect water and replenish water and so on and so forth. He even talked about storage, but the word resiliency is encouraging. But we'll see if anything substantive happens. I mean, I've been writing to some degree about water since I came to California 25 years ago or whatever, and there's sometimes good talk, and then nothing ever happens, so trust but verify. So I've spent most of my career as a journalist. I still write a column and unsigned editorials for the Orange County Register, now part of the Southern California News Group, the 11 newspapers throughout Southern California. And anyway, so I've been asked to touch on some of the media issues. And what should the media do better to inform the public's perception of water issues? I guess I'll say there is some good water coverage, but I don't think anybody, John, has anyone called you from a major Southern California newspaper to do a front page story about the data you provided?
Not since the Orange County Register.
Okay, you see the Register, but I think more of that.
20 years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, more of that kind of coverage might be nice. We're seeing some efforts to cover climate change. For instance, Politico started a new climate change newsletter, which they said in its pitch, climate change isn't just a science story. At its core, it's a story of power and politics. I guess somebody watched the Chinatown movie too many times. Other news outlets have new environmental reporters, often funded by nonprofit groups. I work for a nonprofit group, nothing against nonprofit groups, but I somehow, at least from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of agenda-driven journalism, a lot of scare stories. I could come up with some of the most ridiculous ones I've read. So I'm skeptical we'll see the kind of stories I think we need to have. But there's lots to cover, and in fact, someone ought to write a book about it. I don't know, there's plenty to cover. But I would like to see, I think I know why. Obviously, most environmental reporters tend to have an outlook that's similar to the outlook that the administration has and sees everything through the lens of climate change. When there are, I could just think of dozens of stories. I mean, didn't the state spend like $54 billion on climate change programs last year? Where's all that money going, right? And I haven't seen in print, except in things I've written, that 50% of the state's water flows out to the sea, right? This is averages because they change depending on year, and about 40, these are based on state numbers, about 40% is used for ag, about 10% is for urban users. Total of 5.7 is for residential. So obviously there's some diminishing returns here if we spend all our time trying to stop me from washing my car, which I like to do, or watering my lawn. That's probably not going to make a huge difference, right? So I wouldn't mind seeing more stories on that, on how water shortages harm the economy, the importance, we heard about the importance of the ag economy in California. I mean, I live in the Sacramento Valley, and it's so important. Obviously, it should go without saying, and the impact on low-income residents when the water bills keep going up. So, and how come the state doesn't maintain its infrastructure? Right, the near collapse of the spillways in Oroville. That's not a climate change issue, right? That's just a basic government never maintains its own stuff issue, which I can, even as it proposes other projects, not to mention the high-speed rail. So anyway, I'm running out of time. Our water policy ought to be roughly the same whether or not man-made climate change is the prime villain. We need to invest in the facilities we need, make sure that the state is resilient, because state leaders, the responsibility is to provide enough water for the people who live here. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Now, Dr. Fu, setting aside Dr. Christie's very complex theory of who knows, I wish I had him on retainer when I was doing the weather at Channel 4. Here's Fritz with a 7-day forecast. Your guess is as good as mine. I love that thinking. But Dr. Fu, looking into the near future and maybe even the distant future, what do you think Californians have to look forward to as to drought and climate change?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Let's start from what happened in the last 20 years, because what's going to happen in the next 20 years, we're on that trend. Basically, it's the same trend. And you can always find the exceptions for, say, places like become wetter. But if you look at every data sample you have over a large area, you cannot deny the fact that thermometer doesn't lie. We are warmer now than we were before. Yes, precipitation hasn't changed significantly, but warmer temperature is just going to suck more moisture from the soil. It's that simple. And also there are regions, for example, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, along the coast. We are very blessed because our climate is mainly influenced by cool sea surface temperature. It takes a long time. They are coming from deep ocean and they're cool. So we're very blessed. But if you move to intermountain region or inland California, situation is quite different. So talk about the future. This wet year truly saved us, pulled us from the severe drought. But as the temperature becomes warmer and warmer, it's going to become harder and harder to pull us out of a drought. For example, in the last 20 years, if you have above, if you 30% wettest year, you can get out of drought. But by 20 years down the road, probably even the wettest year couldn't fully recharge the soil moisture loss due to increase of evaporative loss. And so we need to prepare for that. And this is over the whole Western United States. Of course, when you go to specific regions, situation can vary. Also in 20 years from middle of the century, the 2022 drought, right now it's 50 years return time. By then, it will be 14 years return time. So that's kind of a climate we need to prepare for. Is it for sure going to happen? There's uncertainty in climate model projection for sure. But if we don't prepare for it, and should that happen, we will be in big trouble.
Thank you, Dr. Fu. Dr. Christy, so California is a state, because of its climate, prone to drought. And two of the worst ones we've seen in a while were 12 through 16 and 20 through 22. So I think I know the answer to this question after your presentation, but
give it.
Now, how much of this do you think has to do with climate change, the severity of the last two droughts, and how much is water conservation, or is it a combination of the two?
Well, I don't think you can actually identify any of the droughts of the last 10 years due to human-induced climate change, because the methods you would use to do that fail when you go east of the West Coast. They fail. So you would not use those methods at all. And when I showed you the charts, I think it still rains, it still snows. The temperature records you have here in California are unfortunately very biased by urbanization and surface development, and they show a warming due to that more than any kind of background climate change. The background climate change is on the order of just fractions of degrees as we go decade by decade. So it's not something that's going to change the vapor pressure deficit, for example. In fact, I've got records of the vapor pressure deficit back to 1889 in the Central Valley, where it was supposed to be the worst, and it's flat. So I don't think you can assess or claim that humans are causing any kind of deficit there. What can California do? Well, you know, one thing I think, the market works. P.J. O'Rourke said the market always works. And I think you see the market working now in the way water is finding its way to where money is. And I think part of what's going to happen is those high water use, low value crops will find another place to grow. And we welcome, and by the way, other places can grow crops, not just California. In Alabama, we have plenty of water. 70 million acre feet flow off Alabama every year. And we use less than 1% of it. So I'm not talking about fruits and nuts. You guys, the quality you guys produce is just terrific. I mean, it's a wonderful product that you have, but those, you know, corn, if you grow soybeans, cotton, those kind of things, they could be done elsewhere. And that could help create water for you.
Okay, Stephen, you mentioned this in your talk. California seems to have put all its eggs in the climate change basket. Do you think the policies they have in place now are actually going to help our water supply?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think one of the key questions is, what did we do after the last drought ended, right? I remember when Jerry Brown announced the end of the drought, and I've seen a number of executive orders and platitudes, and I just don't see much movement on building these facilities. I mean, I think it's probably true that we probably built the entire state water project in less time than it would take to do a EIR on one small portion of it, but I can't prove that. I just don't. I don't see it. I haven't seen much building. I mean, around me. I mean, this is obviously just anecdotal, but we're dependent on an aging levee system in the southern part of the Sacramento County, which is a very flood-prone area, and you know, you sit there and watch every year, and I keep voting for these levee taxes, right? And then I keep wondering, what the heck? How come they don't fix the levee? So in February, as I was evacuating my property for the third time, I'm not making that up, we had an empty rental house, so I was lucky. But these trucks with the riprap driving up and down my street, and they're just dumping rocks on, I don't know. I mean, I know it's not a, you know, there's a certain element of that in shoring up levees, but I would have liked to think that there'd be some planning on that. So I think part of it is just the state's incompetent at producing any sort of infrastructure, at maintaining any sort of infrastructure. The cost structure is so ridiculous, the CEQA requirements. So I'm not holding my breath that we're going to see, you know, Shasta raised or any, you know, sites or Temperance Flat. No.
What would be your solution?
Oh, I'm a journalist. I can always fall back on that. I don't have to have a solution. I could just criticize. Let's start with better reporting.
No, never mind, because we can't trust what you say.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Well, I would name one of those previous people as czar. Yeah.
You've researched it and done podcasts about it and discussed it with other people. I'm just curious if you think you've, in your own mind, made up your...
And all of the above approach, starting from the top, a commitment to actually build a policy of abundance, to actually make the goal to be create more water supply, of course in an environmentally friendly way, and then do all these many different things. I mean, obviously each of them has to be evaluated based on their cost effectiveness, but do more of all sorts of things. And you know, I can't help, and I'm not like Mr. Desal cheerleader, I understand the critics of it and everything, but the desal plant in Huntington Beach, from what I read, would have handled 12% of the county's water needs, unless somebody here probably knows the data better and will tell me I'm wrong, but I think it was somewhere in that neighborhood, right? It's a 3 million population and growing county. I mean, that's pretty significant if you could help meet 10 or 12% of the needs. Again, I'm not just here pitching for desal, but you do all these many different things. You store more water, you know, stormwater capture, you know, recycling, all sorts of things. Better pricing, that's never discussed. I think that would help. I mean, you know, it is funny. I have tenants who, well, it's not funny, it's obvious. I had tenants who I was paying their water bill. And then I finally had to, when the lease came up, they agreed to start paying their own water bill because it was outlandish, the water bill I was paying. And it dropped by a half. Isn't that amazing? So obvious, but water prices are, you know, they're buffered from that direct pricing like we get with gasoline. What is it, like $17 a gallon now? You drive less. I think if we had a better pricing system, people would more naturally, and there are all sorts of, I know Australia, you know, did a kind of a water market. I have a lot of criticisms of how they did it, because they did it like a cap and trade system with an artificial cap. But it is possible to try different ways to increase market mechanisms rather than just attack water rights.
Yeah. I've read a little about the desal economics, and I've heard that has to be a product of volume and mass. For instance, the country of Israel uses it very effectively for 70% of their water, but it has to be that big to be cost effective. So maybe when we get to that point, we'll be a little better off.
Well, I mean, there's the one down in San Diego County. I mean, I'm not here to argue, you know, I think you ought to have a desal expert here, or, you know, talk about that, but I'm just saying that's one of the examples of a way that you could increase water in the system and create abundance. And then, you know, policymakers have to look at the cost effectiveness of every project, not just pour concrete. But I think the philosophy from the top, certainly in this administration and maybe the last two preceding it, has not been, the focus has been on climate change. And I think that's part of the problem with the whole climate change thing. It takes the focus away from more fundamental questions of government accountability and government policy, right? I don't think many of us here doubt that the climate's changing, but if that's your focus, if your focus is changing the climate of the entire globe, using California policy to lead the way, or whatever, you know, the word that's coming to mind isn't one I want to say publicly, but if that's your goal, then it's pretty bleak, right? But if your goal is to measure the cost effectiveness of projects that will increase the availability of water to the California residents who elect you to serve them, then that's a whole different conversation. Then we could discuss desal. Okay, you could say maybe it's not cost effective. Maybe it doesn't work the way you want. Maybe it needs higher volumes, whatever. But that's a question surrounding what's the best way to get more supply in the system, rather than this kind of amorphous discussion about a topic that, you know, climate change. How do you even address that, right?
Ask Dr. Christy.
Well, I like how he addressed it.
So Dr. Fu, forest management in the state of California has saved a lot of trees, but the additional trees are a tax on our water. What are your comments about that? How do we rectify that?
I think, first of all, depend on what kind of trees. But in general, tree reduce runoff, intercept the water at the canopy, and then retain water in the soil. At the first, it might be, you would think, okay, this take water away from the water that will go to reservoir. But on the other hand, by retaining soil moisture, next rain, you don't have to saturate the soil, use a lot of water first. And there's a water quality. I'm not expert in this area, but I have some knowledge about tree. I think you have to be smart, and not every tree would work, and it would require really the science research to guide the state what kind of trees.
Yeah, and the additional trees make less the possibility of runoff and slides and that kind of thing too.
It does, but it also retains the moisture in the soil, right? So if you, let's say, when you burn the forest, actually runoff increase. But that's bad for water resource, right? Because you have the water quality is low. And also, when the soil is very dry, right? Next rain, you need to, first of all, saturate the soil, and then go runoff. I don't think tree necessarily reduce runoff yet, but the devil is in the detail. You have to measure them, see how they work. But at the very least, it protects the quality of the water. You can have a lot with all the mud and the sediment, and that's not very useful water.
So Steve, you're a journalist. What resources do you trust for climate and water information?
There are a lot of good resources out there, right? I mean, the state and federal documents that I looked at. I mean, there are a lot of academics, who, such as the two here and many others. UC Davis has I was looking at a lot of their water research. The Water Education Foundation is what it's called, the Maven's blog. There's all sorts of stuff. The question is, why aren't average readers getting more of that? I don't think, there's the whole term dealing with politics, rational ignorance, where it's not rational to spend hours and months and days or whatever researching what your local elected official has done, right? Because your vote, the chance of your vote changing anything is so minuscule. I mean, some of us do it for a living, and some people, I know a lot of people who are obsessed with it, but the fact is there's not a lot of payback for doing that kind of research. Now, same thing with the average reader, so I think, you can't realistically expect on any topic people to spend so many hours going through these studies and so forth. I think it's great compared to the old days when I got started in journalism, how easy it is to access all the source information. In fact, I have a copy of that 1957 water plan, which I quote from. It's fascinating, but most people aren't going to do that. So I think we need to try to figure out how we can entice reporters to do a wider range of stories on the topic. And a lot of what I read, some of it's been great, and some of it's ridiculous. Like I was reading one story, and I won't mention the publication, but it focused on one particular urban area that previously was not an urban area and looked at the changing climate over 50 years or whatever it was. Well, it's not surprising that if you go from a farmland, and I'm not mentioning the area, orange groves perhaps, and then beautifully pave it. I mean, it's one of the most beautifully paved places I've seen or ever been. I love Orange County, but the heat, I imagine that the level of heat is going to differ, right? So those kind of stories don't really encourage me. But I read this, I forget which publication, it was some national publication that did this in-depth look at the Australian market, system. So there's good stuff out there. We just need more good stuff and asking tough questions about budgets and not doing this kind of agenda journalism and scare journalism.
A good place for data that I used during the weather is the National Weather Service. People don't even realize that the two offices locally are Oxnard and San Diego. They have a database that's infinite. I mean, if you just want to see the truth, if you want the facts about how much water we've had and how far off normal we are for rainfall and stuff, it's a great thing. Anybody can use it, it's free.
Oh, yeah, no, that's fabulous stuff. My wife's a weather fanatic, so when we were like flooding, I think she was like so fascinated. I think she was excited, and she's watching the water as it tracks out of there and using those databases.
They do the river flood stages. I mean, it really is more information than you could ever use. I mean, they supply the FAA with all their flight weather information. You can get unlimited information. People don't even realize it's a free service. As a weather person, I use two sources, the National Weather Service and my phone. Anyway, we'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. I'm going to stand up because I'm blind. I won't be able to see the back. But does anybody have a question or two for even with
Fritz,
that
I'll kick off the first question, if I may.
I'm sorry.
So for the two professors, at the Orange County Water District, at the Orange County Water District, we manage hundreds of acres of above ground service basins subject to sunlight. And our professional staff has told us that we experience about 1% evaporation. That's an important issue because if it's larger or greater, we have to plan water supply. What has been your experience and knowledge with evaporation and changes potentially to evaporation?
Okay. Based on our data analysis, the evaporation, which is largely driven, evaporation demand has been increasing. Of course, evaporation only trend the evaporation demand if there's enough soil moisture. But evaporation demand has been increasing, and it's probably doubled over the western United States. Of course, I have to look at over Orange County how much. It varies from place to place. But it's very simple. The demand will increase with temperature. If temperature increase, you will lose more moisture from the soil to atmosphere.
Yeah, in the last 10 years, the evaporation has increased in California because, as I showed, the temperature has been higher here than elsewhere. You know, 0.2 of an inch a day, 1/4 inch a day can happen in a dry climate like California. How much does it cost to keep that in the reservoir? I think it'd be a lot more than you'd imagine. I don't know how you could do it.
There we go. Yes, sir.
Question for Mr. Greenhut. I'd just like to point out the book that you edited, Saving California. The 10 pages you wrote in Chapter 5 here have a lot of answers for how California can solve its water problem, and one of them had to do with water pricing. Can you speak a little bit more on water pricing?
First, I like you. You know, whenever I get an email or a call, say, Mr. Green, I want to refer to something you wrote, I'm just like, yeah, it's usually not favorable. So, yeah, water pricing is really complex. It was the hardest chapter to write. I had my 88-year-old mother vet the books. I wanted it to be be readable for a normally intelligent person who knows nothing about California geography. And in that chapter, she made me rewrite, and she was right. It's hard to wrestle through. But basically, pricing affects our behavior. So if we create a system of, a better system of water trading. So for instance, our state has allows water trading, but it could take years to get a trade approved. So I published a chart. It was a state chart, and it looks like one of those Rube Goldberg cartoons. Remember those, where you step on a mouse trap and it flings a canary who lands in a basketball hoop, and well, it's just like that. It's all these little boxes that go around. So if we're going to just simply put, if I want to trade a stock, I want to trade it now, or at least within a couple days. Not 3 years, so we don't have much trading. So I think if we had a better, more vibrant system of water trading, that would be one market mechanism, and pricing, a pricing system that was more directly reflective of our water use, I think would be helpful. The only water pricing system I hear is I'm going to be getting a meter on my well, so that's what the state's doing.
Others? Back of the room. We'll get you a better seat next year. We're so sorry.
June Hayes, San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District. I'm hearing a lot about reliability, which of course is important to all of us. But what I have not heard about today is the Caballero Bill Senate Bill 388, which failed this year. It has a long-term plan. The problem that I see is that every time the administration changes, water policy changes. If we can get Senate Bill 366 passed, that would provide a blueprint well into the future. It would provide for the feast and famine that I'm anticipating with the changing climate, or whether it's human or just natural. And could we talk a little bit about that Senate bill and how that might fit into this, and maybe get some support for it for when it comes back next year?
We're going to talk about that in our next session. That was a great tease, wasn't it? Yeah. If you'll hang around for another hour, we'll have the answer to that question for you. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Ma'am, I can't see you.
I had a question. It has to do with the difference between climate change and human activity. It seems to me those are two different areas and two different issues, although they intertwine. The human activity was referred to by the paving, and obviously we know the difference. We see what happens. Put a thermometer on the street and then put it on your lawn, and you obviously see the difference. But there's that big difference of climate change, which is not over 20 years or 100 years, but it's over much, much longer periods of time. If we look back at some of the major climate change issues that we know historically, for example, the collapse of the Bronze Age was a tremendous situation that occurred. And then we move along in history and we get to the mini ice age. So we do see there is climate change, but it is over much larger periods of time. It seems to me we're compacting it and trying to make observations over data that doesn't really provide the information we need to make those decisions. Thank you.
Dr. Christy, we're throwing this one to you.
Oh, is that a question? I didn't hear the question in there.
Oh, no, she just wanted, she was saying that the climate change has to be looked at in reference to, like, boy, am I glad that bell rang.
Okay.
Climate change is over millennia and not just the recent past, and so.
Right, when Minoans went out in Crete, in 1400 BC or so, that was a big change, we think. But you're correct. The climate, there's climate change, and then there's something called human-induced climate change. And the latest United Nations view is that anything that's climate change is human-induced now. And so they've folded that into the name climate change. So just semantics right there gets you off the wrong track, get you on the wrong track. So climate change will continue to happen. Humans are adding more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so if you think that is a disaster happening, the plants don't think so, by the way. In fact, California might let plants vote someday, and if they do, they're going to want more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You have to.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait a second.
You'll have to deal with China and India if you want to solve that problem.
Don't be so judgmental, Mr. Alabama. At least we can vote for stuff out here when we want to.
Yeah.
Well, I like living in Alabama.
But that's a great. But you're making it sound like none of these things are negative in the atmosphere. The chlorofluorocarbons and the reduction of the ozone layer. Those things are bad, whether they affect the climate or not.
Right. I was only talking about carbon dioxide.
Oh, okay.
which is the big greenhouse gas that we produce extra. We are producing it. It is active in the 15 micron band. It does increase forcing. There's no question. But how does the climate respond to that? And our research shows it doesn't respond very much at all. It does respond some, but not the catastrophic things you read about in the press out here, unfortunately.
Oh.
Can I respond?
Yes, ma'am.
I think this is a really great question. Climate do changing. throughout the Earth's history, but the cause is different. So now the difference is the rate of the changing. Overwhelming evidence suggests in the last 100 years, the warming is due to increase of CO2.
And I would disagree with that.
You disagree, but overwhelming evidence shows that.
That's all right. Give our panelists a big round of applause. Really interesting.